Look up at the tallest tree you have ever seen in your life. Maybe it was a redwood standing in a cathedral grove in Northern California, pushing 300 feet into a sky you could barely see through the canopy. Maybe it was a Douglas fir on a mountain ridge, or an ancient oak in a field somewhere, its trunk so wide that 3 people holding hands could not wrap their arms around it. You stood at the base of that tree, and you tilted your head back as far as it would go, and something happened to you in that moment that does not happen very often in modern life. You felt small, not metaphorically small, not philosophically small in the way you feel small reading about the size of the universe, physically measurably, viscerally small, the kind of small that reminds your body what it actually is in relation to the world it lives in. Hold that feeling. Now I need you to do something with it. I need you to take that tree, that enormous tree that made you feel like an insect, and I need you to imagine that it is a sapling. Not a young tree, a sapling, a juvenile, something that has barely begun. Imagine that the thing you were looking at, the thing that produced that feeling of genuine smallness in your chest, was not even close to a mature specimen of its kind. Imagine that above the canopy you were staring up into, there was another canopy. A real canopy, not metaphorical, not theoretical, an actual layer of branches and leaves at a height that the tree you were standing under had not yet reached. And above that second canopy, another one, and above that another. Imagine that the real forest, the original forest, the forest that this planet produced when it was operating at full capacity, made the redwoods look like the weeds that grow in the cracks of a sidewalk. This is not a thought experiment. This is not a fantasy constructed to make you feel something. This is geology. This is the fossil record. This is chemistry preserved in stone and ice that has been sitting in archives and laboratories for decades, waiting for someone to put it all on the same table and ask the question that the official story has never been willing to ask. Where did the giant trees go? And why does everything else, the oxygen record, the fossil record, the maps, the buildings, the bones found in the oldest layers of the oldest cities, why does all of it point toward the same answer that nobody with institutional authority wants to say out loud? The story starts with oxygen, not the concept of oxygen, not the chemistry of it in any abstract sense. The specific, measurable, documented, peer-reviewed fact that the air we breathe today is not the air this planet was designed to produce. It is not the air this planet produced for most of its history. It is not even close. Ice cores drilled from the deepest layers of the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets contain trapped bubbles of ancient atmosphere. These bubbles are time capsules of a precision that no human archive can match. Scientists extract them in controlled laboratory conditions and measure the exact molecular composition of air from thousands of years ago, from tens of thousands of years ago, from periods of Earth history that predate every human civilization we have a name for. What they find consistently, repeatedly, across multiple research teams in multiple countries using multiple methodologies, is that oxygen levels in the ancient past were significantly higher than the 21% we breathe today. Not slightly higher, significantly. And when you move beyond the ice cores to the amber record, to the fossilized tree resin that sealed pockets of ancient air inside itself like a biological time capsule millions of years ago, the numbers become genuinely difficult to process. Oxygen concentrations of 30% and above, 30%. You are breathing 21% right now. At sea level, at rest, in good health, with a full night of sleep behind you and no unusual stress on your respiratory system, you are breathing 21% oxygen. We treat that number as fixed, as natural, as the baseline condition of a living planet. We treat it the way we treat the speed of light or the gravitational constant, as a given, as background, as something that simply is and has always been. But the planet's own chemical record says otherwise. The planet's own record says that 21% is not the baseline, it is the aftermath. At 30% oxygen, everything is different. Combustion happens faster and with greater intensity, which is why the Carboniferous coal deposits formed in the first place, because the trees that created them burned with a ferocity that modern fire models cannot replicate. Insects grow larger because of the way they breathe. Unlike mammals and birds, insects do not have lungs. They breathe through a network of tubes called tracheae that deliver oxygen directly to their tissues through passive diffusion. The size an insect can reach is directly limited by how efficiently oxygen can diffuse through that system. At 21%, that limit produces the insects we know. At 30%, that limit expands dramatically, and the fossil record shows exactly what it expands to. Dragonflies with wingspans of 2.5 feet, millipedes 8 feet long. Scorpions the size of large dogs, centipedes that could wrap around a human torso. These are not mythological creatures. They are documented fossil species. Their bones and exoskeletons have been excavated from coal deposits around the world. Paleontologists explain them readily as products of ancient high-oxygen environments and then move on without asking the question that should follow immediately. If the oxygen was 30%, what was producing it? Because oxygen at that concentration does not appear by accident. It is produced by photosynthesis. It is produced by living things converting sunlight and carbon dioxide into organic matter and releasing oxygen as a byproduct. And to produce 30% atmospheric oxygen and maintain it across millions of years requires a volume of photosynthetic activity that our current biosphere, with all of its forests and phytoplankton and grasslands, cannot come close to matching. The answer to what produced it is not mysterious. It is not hidden in any classified document or sealed in any archive. It is sitting in the geological record in plain sight. It is the coal. The Carboniferous period, roughly 350 to 300 million years ago, is named for the carbon it deposited into the Earth's crust. Every seam of coal that humans have ever mined, every deposit that powered the Industrial Revolution, every underground layer of fossil carbon on this planet, is the compressed and fossilized biological remains of that era's forests. This is not disputed. It is not a fringe claim. It is standard geology taught in every introductory earth science course on the planet. What produced the coal was biological material on a scale that is genuinely, almost impossibly, difficult to comprehend. The dominant trees of the Carboniferous were not the ancestors of our current forests in any direct sense. They were organisms called lycopods, giant club mosses, relatives of the tiny ground-hugging plants you might step over on a forest hike today. In the Carboniferous, they grew to heights of 160 feet. Species called Sigillaria had trunks 3 to 6 feet in diameter. Species called Lepidodendron reached 150 feet, with a distinctive bark covered in diamond-shaped leaf scars that still appear today when you look at a fresh coal face in a mine. These were not small plants that happened to get compacted over millions of years into the coal seams we extract. These were forests of biological production so massive, so relentless in their photosynthetic output, that when the trees died and fell, the decomposition systems that would normally return their carbon to the atmosphere did not yet exist. The lignin in their wood was a new biochemical compound, something evolution had not yet produced a solution for. No fungi had evolved to break it down. No bacteria had developed the enzymatic toolkit to digest it, so the trees fell. And instead of rotting back into carbon dioxide and water and returning to the cycle, they accumulated. Layer after layer of fallen biological material, piling up in the swampy lowlands where these forests grew, compressed under geological weight over millions of years, transformed by heat and pressure into the black seams of carbon that powered the 19th and 20th centuries. The oxygen those trees produced during their lives, the byproduct of all that photosynthesis, went into the atmosphere and stayed there because the carbon that would have balanced it was locked underground instead of being returned to the air through decomposition. That is where the 30% came from. That is the chemistry behind the number in the ice cores. That is what the amber was preserving when it sealed those ancient air bubbles inside itself. The record of a world powered by a forest we cannot imagine. Now comes the part that the mainstream story does not know how to handle. Because the mainstream story says the Carboniferous forests disappeared 300 million years ago. It says the transition from those giant lycopod forests to the seed-bearing forests that eventually gave rise to our current trees was a gradual process across geological deep time. It says there is no connection between those ancient forests and anything that happened within human history or even within the history of our species. But there is a separate body of evidence, geologically much more recent and in some ways much harder to dismiss, that suggests the story of the giant trees does not end 300 million years ago. That suggests they were still here. That the silicon dioxide formations we call mesas and buttes and rock columns scattered across the American Southwest, the formations rising from the Sahara, the stone pillars of Cappadocia in Turkey, the columns of the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, the hexagonal stone formations in dozens of locations around the world, are not made of rock in the way we typically understand rock. That they are the fossilized, silicated, mineralized remains of trees so large that when they fell and converted to stone over centuries, we looked at the results and thought we were looking at mountains. Silicon dioxide is the primary mineral compound in wood after it silicates. When wood petrifies, mineral-rich groundwater permeates the cellular structure of the dead wood and replaces the organic material with stone, molecule by molecule, crystal by crystal, preserving the original shape of the wood with extraordinary fidelity. We have extensive evidence of this process. We have the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, where ancient logs 200 million years old lie scattered across a desert landscape, their original cellular structure still visible under microscope, their growth rings still countable, their grain still readable like the grain of freshly cut timber. Those logs are 150 to 200 feet long. They are already beyond anything alive today. Now look at the mesas of the Colorado Plateau. Really look at them. Not as the background of a road trip, not as the postcard landscape of the American West, but as geological objects whose physical characteristics can be described and compared. Look at the flat tops. Look at the vertical sides. Look at the way the sides flare outward very slightly at the base, exactly the way the base of a large tree flares as the root system begins to spread. Look at the internal layering visible in the cliff faces, layering that when examined by researchers who know what they are looking for does not match the random horizontal stratification of sedimentary deposition, but instead shows patterns consistent with the concentric ring structure of biological growth. Look at Devil's Tower in Wyoming. Really look at it. It is 867 feet tall. It rises from the surrounding landscape with an abruptness that does not look like the gradual erosion of a plateau or the remnant of a mountain range. It rises the way a stump rises from a cleared field. Its columns are hexagonal. They are geometrically regular in a way that draws immediate attention from anyone who looks at them carefully. They run from the base of the structure to the flat top with a consistency that the official geological explanation, volcanic intrusion that cooled and fractured, accounts for in general terms but struggles to explain in specific detail when you examine the geometry closely. The people who look at Devil's Tower and say it looks like a tree stump are not confused. They are noticing something real. The geometry is real. The flat top is real. The radial column structure is real. The question of whether the resemblance indicates anything is a legitimate scientific question, not a conspiracy theory. A question. The name Tartaria appears on European maps from the 13th century through the 18th century, not on fringe maps, not on the maps of eccentric cartographers working outside the mainstream of their profession, on the standard maps produced by the most respected cartographic houses in Europe, maps by Mercator, maps by Ortelius. Maps that were the authoritative geographic references of their era, used by governments and navies and trading companies for navigation and planning. Tartaria, sometimes spelled Tartary, covers a territory stretching from Eastern Europe across Central Asia to the Pacific coast of what is now Russia. On some of these maps it is divided into Russian Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and independent Tartary. On some maps it is the largest labeled political entity on the page, dwarfing every European nation, dwarfing China, dwarfing the Ottoman Empire. On some maps it is simply labeled Magna Tartaria, Great Tartary, and then in the 19th century it disappears. Not gradually, the way empires usually decline across generations of maps that show the slow contraction of borders and the emergence of successor states. It disappears abruptly. The territory gets absorbed into Russia and China, and the nations we recognize today with no official historical account of what Tartaria was as a political entity, who administered it, what language its government conducted, what its capital was, or why an entity large enough to dominate the Eurasian landmass across 5 centuries of European cartography left behind no diplomatic correspondence, no succession crisis, no refugee population, no defeated ruling class, no literature. No legal tradition, no coins, no monuments that anyone has labeled Tartarian. The mainstream explanation is that Tartaria was never a unified empire. That it was a geographic designation, a cartographic convenience for the vast and poorly documented lands east of the Ural Mountains that European mapmakers did not know how to classify and so labeled collectively with the name of the most prominent people associated with those regions, the Tartars, the nomadic confederation that Genghis Khan had organized into a military force centuries earlier. That explanation has genuine merit. It is not unreasonable. But it does not account for the buildings. All over the world, in cities on every inhabited continent, there are buildings that do not match their official construction histories. Not in minor ways, in fundamental ways. Buildings in cities supposedly founded in the 18th or early 19th century, with foundations that descend to depths the surface structures do not require and cannot explain. Buildings whose basement levels were classified as subterranean after the fact, even though they were clearly designed as ground floor spaces, with full-height windows looking out at what is now below street level, with entrance doors whose handles sit at knee height, because the doors were installed when the ground outside was 2 or 3 feet lower than it is today. Buildings whose interior dimensions, whose ceiling heights, whose door widths, whose staircase proportions are calibrated for occupants significantly larger than any human population, the official history of those buildings accounts for. The World's Fairs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries are the most concentrated and most documented example of what the researchers examining this evidence point to repeatedly. The 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition covered 690 acres of the South Lakefront. It included over 200 major buildings, many of them structures of genuinely enormous scale, constructed in a period of approximately 2 years. Professional architects and construction engineers who have studied the project in detail say the timeline is not possible with the materials and methods and labor organization the official accounts describe. Not difficult. Not impressive, not a remarkable achievement of industrial-age construction management, not possible, and yet the buildings existed. 27 million people visited them. Photographs document them in extraordinary detail. The interiors showed not the hasty finishes of structures built under impossible time pressure, but pipe organs installed into the walls of exhibition halls. Mosaic tile floors laid with a precision that requires weeks per room. Vaulted ceilings with frescoes. Integrated heating systems running through the walls. Acoustic engineering built into the proportions of the great halls. The kind of acoustic design that does not happen by accident and does not happen quickly, and requires a tradition of accumulated knowledge about how sound moves through space that the young American Republic of the 1890s was not supposed to possess. These are not the features of temporary exhibition buildings constructed on a deadline for a 6-month fair. These are the features of permanent infrastructure built by civilization that understood what it was doing and intended what it was building to last, and then they were demolished. That is the part that the Tartarian researchers return to again and again, because it is genuinely strange when you think about it without the official framing. Structures that took 2 years and tens of millions of dollars to construct were torn down within months of the fair's closing, not repurposed. Not converted to other uses that might justify their maintenance. Demolished. The official explanation is that they were always temporary, exhibition structures built of plaster over steel frames, never intended for permanent occupation. But the pipe organs were not plaster. The mosaic floors were not temporary. The integrated heating systems were not the fittings of a building designed to last 6 months. Someone built permanent features into structures the official story says were always going to be destroyed. That contradiction has never been resolved. The mud flood theory is the part of the Tartarian reconstruction that sounds the most immediately implausible and turns out, on examination, to be the part with the most direct physical evidence. The theory holds that at some point in the relatively recent past, recent in geological terms meaning within the last few centuries, or possibly more recently than that, a catastrophic event deposited a substantial layer of sediment across enormous swathes of the northern hemisphere. Not a flood in the biblical sense of water rising, and then receding and leaving things approximately where they were. A flood of material, mud, ash, glacial debris, the kind of mixed sediment that catastrophic events produce, that settled and solidified and raised the ground level in affected areas by several feet. The physical evidence is in the buildings, and it is everywhere once you know what to look for. Go to any major European city with a medieval or early modern historic core. Look at the oldest buildings. Look at the ground floors. In a normal building, the ground floor is at street level. The windows of the ground floor look out at street level. The entrance doors open at street level. In hundreds of buildings across European city centers, this relationship is wrong. The ground floor is below street level. The windows of what the architectural record identifies as the original ground floor look out at what is now below the pavement. The entrance that the building's design clearly intends as the primary entrance is accessed by descending steps from the current street. In some cases, the original ground floor has been converted to a basement with no acknowledgement in the building's official history of when or why that conversion occurred. The standard explanations are subsidence and deliberate street raising. Subsidence is the gradual sinking of a building into soft ground over time. It is real and it happens, but subsidence lowers the building relative to the street. It does not raise the street relative to the building. Deliberate street raising is also real. Cities have raised their street levels for drainage and infrastructure reasons throughout history. Chicago did it famously in the 1850s and 60s, and the process is documented in extraordinary detail, in city council records, in newspaper accounts, in the engineering specifications of the project, in the photographs taken during the raising operations showing entire city blocks being lifted by synchronized jack systems while people continued living and working in the buildings being raised. The documentation exists because the project was planned, announced, contracted, and executed through normal civic processes that generate records. For dozens of other cities where the same physical evidence of changed ground level exists in the buildings, no equivalent documentation exists. The ground level simply appears to have changed, without announcement, without planning documents, without engineering contracts, without newspaper coverage. Without any official record that anyone noticed the ground was a different height than it had been. That absence of record is not evidence of nothing. The absence of record for an event of that magnitude is itself evidence that the event was not a planned civic project. It was something that happened to cities rather than something cities did to themselves. Here is where all of it connects. The oxygen, the giant trees, the silicated formations that look like stumps, the disappeared empire, the buildings with windows below the street, the megafauna extinctions, the bones found in old city foundations suggesting occupants larger than modern humans. The connection is atmospheric and it is biological, and it is the kind of cascade that a single sufficiently catastrophic event could initiate and sustain across centuries. A large impact event, a major air burst, a geomagnetic disruption causing pole shift and the flooding that would follow, any of these would produce enormous quantities of particulate matter. soot from fires, ash from vaporized rock, mineral dust thrown into the upper atmosphere. These materials would block sunlight with an efficiency that is not hypothetical but documented from smaller events. The eruption of Tambora in 1815 produced a year without summer across the northern hemisphere. Crops failed, temperatures dropped, people starved in regions that had not been anywhere near the eruption. A significantly larger event would produce effects not across 1 year, but across decades. Sunlight blocked means photosynthesis reduced. Photosynthesis reduced means oxygen production reduced. Oxygen production reduced in a world whose atmospheric oxygen was already being maintained by a forest cover vastly larger and more productive than anything alive today means the oxygen reduction is not marginal. It is catastrophic. It is not the kind of reduction that stresses organisms at the edges of their tolerance range. It is the kind of reduction that kills everything adapted to the old atmosphere and leaves alive only the things flexible enough to survive in the new one. Now look at the megafauna extinction record. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths reaching 20 feet in length, cave bears, short-faced bears, dire wolves, giant beavers the size of black bears, glyptodonts, terror birds. The vast majority of the large animal species that existed on Earth go extinct in what paleontologists describe as a geological eye blink, a period of a few thousand years clustered tightly around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, corresponding to the end of the last ice age, and the period identified in the geological record as the Younger Dryas. Sudden and severe return to glacial conditions following a period of warming that has never been satisfactorily explained by gradual climate models. The standard explanation for the megafauna extinction is twofold: climate change and human hunting. Warming climates disrupted the habitat of cold-adapted species. Human hunters spreading across previously unoccupied continents encountered animals with no fear of humans and hunted them to extinction with a speed enabled by that naivety. This explanation is not wrong in its parts. Climate changed, humans hunted, but the explanation has problems that its proponents have not resolved. Many of the species that went extinct in this period had survived previous interglacial warming events of comparable magnitude. The mammoths had been through warm periods before and come through them. The hunting hypothesis requires human population densities and technological capabilities in the immediate post-glacial period that the archaeological record does not support. Humans were not numerous enough and not well armed enough to hunt dozens of large species to extinction simultaneously across multiple continents in a few thousand years. The alternative fits the evidence better: an atmospheric event causing rapid oxygen reduction. Species adapted to high oxygen environments failing to adapt quickly enough to survive the transition. The largest animals with the highest metabolic demands going first. Smaller animals with lower oxygen requirements surviving in greater numbers. Humans, the most adaptable generalist species in the history of complex life on Earth, surviving because generalism is specifically the trait that allows survival when the rules change catastrophically and without warning. And so here we are. Smaller than our ancestors were. Shorter-lived than the evidence of older bones suggests our predecessors were. Breathing an atmosphere diminished from what this planet was built to produce. Living in cities that are built on top of older cities, whose ground floors are now our basements, whose windows now look up at streets that were once level with them, whose foundations go deeper than our buildings require, because they were sunk into a ground that was once several feet higher before whatever happened. The grand neoclassical architecture that appeared across the world in the early 19th century, the enormous civic buildings of St. Petersburg and Chicago and San Francisco and Melbourne and Buenos Aires, all of them sharing a design language of such specificity that their simultaneous appearance in cities on opposite sides of the planet cannot be explained by independent parallel development, suggests that someone was working from memory, from templates. From a tradition of knowledge that had been partially preserved through the catastrophe and was being deployed in the reconstruction rather than discovered freshly in each location. The technology embedded in those buildings confirms it: the integrated heating systems, the acoustic engineering, the water management. The structural solutions that appear in buildings constructed by societies that the official historical record describes as being at the early stages of industrial development, societies that should not yet have accumulated the centuries of trial and error required to understand these problems at the level the buildings demonstrate. What we call the Industrial Revolution is, in this reading, not a revolution at all. It is a recovery. It is the process of a civilization that lost its technological foundation in a catastrophe, gradually reconstructing what was lost, rediscovering what was forgotten, finding in the compressed remains of the original forest the energy source that allowed the reconstruction to accelerate. We burn coal. Coal is the compressed remains of the original forest. We are burning the forest to power the civilization that replaced the one the forest supported. The irony is so complete, it almost reads as intentional. The question of Tartaria is not ultimately about maps or empires or the political history of Central Asia. It is about continuity. It is about whether the civilization we live in is the natural culmination of human development across recorded history, or whether it is something else. A reconstruction, a recovery attempt. A civilization working from fragments of a memory it cannot fully access, building things that feel right without knowing entirely why they feel right, deploying solutions to problems it does not remember having solved before. The architecture suggests the latter. The bones suggest the latter. The oxygen record suggests the latter. The blank look on people's faces when you say the name Tartaria, the complete absence from public consciousness of an entity that dominated half the surface of the planet on maps used by educated Europeans for 5 centuries, that blank look is not ignorance. It is not a gap in education that better schools would fill. It is the signature of something removed, something that was present in the record and then was not. You do not forget the name of the largest empire on Earth by accident. You do not collectively stop teaching it, stop referencing it, stop finding it in the primary sources because it was never important. The trees are still there, turned to stone, rising from desert floors and river valleys, their flat tops and radial columns and root-flared bases preserved in silicon dioxide for anyone willing to look at them and say what they see rather than what they have been told to see. The stumps are still there. The oxygen is still lower than it should be. Buildings still have windows below the street. And somewhere under every old city in the Northern Hemisphere, there are floors that were once at ground level and are now below it, waiting for someone to ask not how they got there, but what was standing on them before the mud came and the world above them became a different world entirely, populated by smaller creatures with shorter lives and thinner air, and no memory of what the planet looked like when it was running at full capacity and the trees touched the sky.